Namaskar, everybody. Thanks, Maitita, for the introduction. Nice to see everybody. Thanks, everybody, for joining on the recording. Sorry, I couldn't be there live at the normal time. But let's see, I guess, yeah, I have some things prepared, but I'm actually more interested in what are you all interested in. Please jump in, interrupt me, ask questions. You can put things in the chat. I'll try to keep notice of that. And then for folks on the recording, I'll share my contact info, get in touch. Happy to be a resource and share what I can. So yeah, I have some thoughts prepared, but I also know, there's some seasoned cooperators in the space. So yeah, that's why I'm kind of I'm more curious what you're curious about. But I'll start with some framing thoughts that I've prepared, and then let's see where it goes. Okay, sound good? How's everybody feeling today? Thanks for taking your time to join us, and thanks for your care and concern about economic democracy. And yeah, I wanted to start by just revisiting some of the basic principles of Proud, right? So basic needs should be provided to everybody without discrimination, right? Without exception. And not only that, but the level of advancement of the basic needs is the measure of the vitality of society, right? So if we take that metric, oh, it's so sad to see, what's playing out right now, right? So we have the widening gap, right? The wealth gets more extreme, and then that minimum standard is actually getting lower in a lot of cases. And also, one of the principles, along with the make sure everybody has basic needs, is that we should also limit hoarding, or hoarding should be directly, deliberately approved rather than stolen, which is, I would argue, what's happening. Also, I wanted to reference the social cycle, the concept, Pierre Sarkar's concept of the social cycle, containing four main classes or types of psychic development: workers, warriors, intellectuals, and merchants. And the principle of that the social cycle advances by moving through those stages, right? And then, of course, as spiritualists, as many of us are, the goal is to become somewhat evolved in each area, and then reside at the center of the circle in the Sadvipra category, or Sadvipra as an integrated expression of those four types of development. Is this making sense? Have people heard this stuff before? Good. Glad it's, I'm getting the acknowledgement, but even just preparing is just, to me, it's such an elegant expression, right? It's very simple, but very powerful. So with that as a framing, and I could just, as a quick analysis, say that each stage comes into dominance. There's a rise, a zenith, and a decline. And I would argue we're in, called late capitalism, or a declining Vaishyan or merchant phase. And so the role of the Sadvipra is to accelerate the movement to the next phase, right? So if we recognize all that framing, the problem statement, where we're at, then our work, our task is, how do we advance it to the next stage, which would be the workers taking back over, taking control. And that makes a lot of sense if we look at our, I might call it the overdevelopment of the global economy. And so what we need is workers actually to regain control, right? So instead of the capitalists being in control, the workers would gain control. So worker cooperatives, economic democracy is a very valid, relevant technique or strategy to do that. Yeah, so I want to, that's kind of the framing I was thinking of, and then yeah, how would we go about doing that, and what are some of the nuances? Again, it's the big picture. It's kind of elegant and simple, but if we're gonna encourage that transition from late capitalism, how do we go about doing that? And I'm happy to say I see that happening. More and more young people are, for example, working with their hands. As my teacher said, I first started a woodworking cooperative, right? So instead of going into business or going into academia, I started building things with my hands, right? And there's this myth that Americans don't want to work with their hands. When I had that woodworking cooperative, I was flooded with applications of people who wanted to work with us. Why? Because it was a beautiful work experience. We were making beautiful furniture. We were doing it with a community of peers that had democratic control. We were engaged in, a network of cooperatives and a regional business, and so there was a high degree of satisfaction at work. And we were making things that would last beyond our days, right? Making heirlooms. And I see a lot of people going into farming, right? And production. And so this idea that Americans don't want to work with their hands is just wrong. In fact, I'd argue it's part of a balanced lifestyle. And if we look at people spending more time at desks, on computers, sitting in cars, sitting on couches, we see a decline in health and also a decline in satisfaction, fulfillment, connection, etc. So there's kind of many things that support this move being timely and appropriate. How's this landing? Anybody comments, questions? See some nodding. Please jump in. I don't like to be the only one talking.
What are you involved with these days?
Yes.
What are you involved with these days?
Oh yeah, I'll definitely talk more about that.
I had a question, Shawn, about when you said that you put in an announcement for other workers to join your furniture cooperative. Had you already established the cooperative? How many people were part of your cooperative when you put out the announcement that you needed additional help? How did that work? Did you already have 3 people? Did you already incorporate? How did that work?
Sure. Well, let's see. I ran that organization for 13 years, so there was kind of many moments that we were recruiting for help. We didn't even know necessarily that we were a cooperative to begin with, but we were just cooperating and sharing the space and building things together. And it wasn't until it was literally, I took initiation in Nundamarga, I read the Proud Philosophy, and then I got connected to the Bay Area, what's called No Boss Network of Bay Area Worker Cooperatives. So that was actually the start of that company being a formal cooperative. And then as we grew, we would hire employees, but they had a pathway to ownership. And so we were around 10 people in the business, but I don't know, we probably had maybe 30 or 40 people, that worked there at different times. And so there was different moments that we hired. But it would be when those job descriptions went out, it would say on there, this is a worker-owned cooperative. This is not just a normal business. If you're interested, you can tell us what woodworking skills you have, but you also need to tell us why you would be interested to be part of a worker-owned cooperative. And so we use those values as a filter for hiring people.
Very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'd be curious how you set up the buy-in for people, how that was structured, and were people hired as sort of apprentices, and then at some point there was that decision point that did they want to join as a member of the cooperative or an employee of the cooperative?
Sure. So there's a kind of a huge diversity for how cooperatives structure, the buy-in, everything from there's cooperatives where day one, you're full ownership, full governance rights, very, very flat, very egalitarian. And then there's cooperatives where you might have to work there for 10 or 20 years and then a very significant cash buy-in, maybe $50,000 or something like that. So there's a huge spectrum, and I don't think that any one of them is right or wrong, but what I do is support teams and just considering what might be right for them. For the woodworking cooperative and a lot of cooperatives, I think we had a year buy-in or a year trial period. So you'd be an employee for a period of a year, and then you would signal that you wanted to be a worker owner candidate, and then you would have a period of time whereas the candidacy period, and you would be learning about governance and participating and training, etc. And then at the end of that time, then there would be a vote by the existing members to either invite you in as a member, extend your trial period, or decline your membership. There's various decision points there.
Thank you.
Well, I've got a question. So if as you're in your current work as a consultant for socially conscious enterprises, can you comment on kind of the trend in interest in worker cooperatives? Is there more awareness? Is it kind of a little bit, perhaps you could comment on that, whether the interest is growing.
Thank you. Yeah, I was going to mention kind of it as a big picture, and I'll tie it in there. But whereas in this country, cooperatives are either completely unheard of or somewhat rare. Especially if you're in any type of economic setting, like a business school. It's not even thought of or listed as an option to structure even some of the green or sustainable MBAs. It's starting to shift. I heard just in the last year or two, of one graduate level course on worker cooperatives, but it's still really just off the table. But I will, and I like to point out, the only reason we're here as humans is because we've been cooperating for millennia, right? In small bands and highly cooperative. And so the rest of the world actually is much more cooperative and collaborative than the United States. Or another way to put it is we're really lagging in cooperating, and everything here is set up very individualistic, very competitive. For example, when you're going through the school system, you only get a grade for yourself, right? You don't get a grade for the class. Whereas in other cultures, there's much more a sense of the group being, at least of equal importance, or in many cultures of much more importance than the individual. So it's really counter trend for the United States. But I am happy to report. So I'm, let's see, 25 years a worker owner myself of just my various cooperative enterprises, and I have especially in the last decade and even in the last 5 years, there is a significant growth curve. The United States Federation of Worker Co-ops about a decade ago was reporting 300 to 400 worker co-ops in the US, and now they're reporting around 1,000. So that's like over double growth. And along with that, we're seeing the growth of networks. The Federation itself was founded in 2004. We sent some of our woodworkers there to the founding conference, and they've become a force for advocacy, skill development, funding. And there's quite a few regional cooperative networks. I mentioned the Bay Area one. There's one in New York, NICNOC, NYC, NOWC, Network of Worker Cooperatives, Philadelphia, Portland. So there's regional networks popping up and getting more robust. And yeah, there's I think some wonderful trends, right? So instead of like one model emerging of, hey, this is the way to do a co-op, there's a diversity, right? Which again is another principle of Proud. Diversity is how consciousness expresses itself, not in a singular fashion, but in multiplicity and plurality. And that's what we need. We need diversity of solutions, you know, in my opinion, to offer solutions. So we're seeing, you know, some of these networks are, you know, more like trade associations, but then there's also cooperatives that are launching as integrated networks. And I'm thinking of, you may have heard of Cooperation Jackson, and there's a few other ones around the country that have kind of picked up this model. There's Cooperation Buffalo, Cooperation Richmond, where they're taking kind of a ecosystemic approach and not just one grocery store, et cetera, but they're looking at a region and saying, hey, how do we develop you know, an economic democracy network here, and we can grow food and produce food and provide jobs and meet needs for the community. So I think that's a great pattern. Evergreen Cooperatives out of Cleveland is somewhat of a similar one. Pacific Northwest Cooperative Development Center, yes, awesome. Yeah, and there's like more and more of that, so really wonderful. Also, there's innovation on the actual structures of the cooperatives. Folks may be familiar. Let's see. I have some slides here. Folks like slides? I can show you some visuals. Let's see, can you see this? So I just pulled some slides together from our MBA course. So we often get this question of like, what structure should I be? And so this is just kind of a list of some of the structures. But what we see for cooperatives, and you know, cooperative is just like one bullet point on this list, is most cooperatives actually in this country are one of these other things. And so we draw, let's see, we draw a distinction between the legal structure and the operational structure. So the legal structure could be any one of the, you know, LLC, corporation, worker cooperative, even a nonprofit. And so that's how you're registered with the state, which is fine. But I often say I don't really care so much how you're registered with the state. I mean, you should be compliant. That's great. There may be an advantage to a certain one or not. But really what's going to make the organization work is the operational structure and how well the team cooperates and, you know, does things like, this is an example of an org chart, like who's doing what and what are clear expectations, roles, responsibilities, etc. So yeah, most co-ops are some other legal structure, and then they have a cooperative operating agreement. That's something like 80% of the worker-owned cooperatives in the US are not incorporated as a worker-owned cooperative. Here's a slide on just some of the different types of cooperatives, producer cooperatives. Sometimes people are surprised. Didn't know Sunkist was a co-op. Oh my goodness, or Ocean Spray. Yeah, this is where the farms, the individual farm itself is not a co-op, of course, but then they put their produce together, aggregate, so they're basically marketing and selling their product together with other producers, which is great. And that's the original legal cooperative structure in this country. It's coming from the agricultural producer co-ops. There's consumer co-ops. Hey, Park Slope, there we go. REI co-op, yeah, many grocery stores. There's many consumer co-ops, worker co-ops. Again, we've been talking about, and there's again growing numbers of these. And then this is a new evolution, generally called multi-stakeholder co-op. But what it just means is that there's more than one ownership category. So some combination of the previous producer, consumer, worker, but we're also seeing evolutions of just community member, investor owner, and even different, and then within these, each membership class having a differentiated kind of rights and responsibilities. And some interesting things such as investor owners actually don't get decision-making rights. which is again a refreshing break from capitalism, where people with capital get to take control of things even when they don't come around or work here. And so this way people can invest their capital, maybe get a return, but they actually don't get governance control. And this is really just in the last decade, seeing a lot of these develop, and continuing to see them evolve. So, for example, Our Table Cooperative, they're near the Portland, Oregon area, and they are a vertically integrated food system where they have it's maybe like an 85-acre biodynamic farm, but instead of just growing stuff, then they have a commercial food processing facility on site where they process food, and then they have a full grocery store on site. And so you can join as a CSA and get your produce through there, or you can just go shop in the grocery store. When you go and shop at the grocery store, then the producer owners all have their products there. So local cheese and other products, dairy, and whatever else is being produced in the local region, and they all have an ownership stake. And so the workers are the owners, the consumers are the owners, and the producers are the owners. So it's pretty cool model. Platform cooperatives have also been evolving in the last decade, and so these are basically technology platforms. But again, instead of wealthy capital holders and tech workers being the owners, they have some degree of multi-stakeholder ownership inside a technology platform. In fact, there's a group of friends that they're trying to buy Twitter and convert Twitter to a platform cooperative. I don't know if they'll get there, but I really appreciate the thinking, right? And if you see everything that's going wrong with this kind of concentrated ownership, this I think is a powerful solution to consider.
Might have an eager seller with Twitter.
Maybe. Here's a couple other things. Trusts. Elsewhere in the world, there are worker-owned cooperatives and other types of cooperatives that the legal structure is actually a trust or an employee-owned trust. The John Lewis partnership in the UK is like kind of like a Macy's department store, but they have something like, I think, 80,000 employees, and they are an employee-owned trust. And that's one of the models where day one, you're a full worker owner, full rights, full benefits as everybody else. But the structure is owned in a trust, and that trust can never be pulled out of employee ownership. And then an evolution, some folks maybe have heard of Patagonia donating their company to a—
Are they doing, are you using that model you're describing? So what Patagonia is doing, a trust? Is Patagonia using the model of a trust?
Yeah, they've gifted the company to a purpose trust.
Right.
So then the ownership is the purpose, and not the workers and not the shareholders. It's the purpose. So I believe the Patagonia purpose, and they haven't released the document, so we can't see exactly. But it's the purpose is to use the profits of the clothing company to preserve the ecology and fight against climate change. So they're doing something like $100 million a year going into funding those efforts because of putting the company into a purpose trust. Maybe I'll pause here. That's kind of a lot of information. How's this landing, or any other questions, comments coming up?
I'm curious, and it kind of piggybacks on an earlier question. Have you seen any trends in terms of existing businesses converting to a cooperative model instead of just starting out that way?
Definitely. Yeah, there's a big trend. they're kind of calling it the silver tsunami of all the baby boomers that own small businesses retiring. And there's a very concerted effort to try to get as many of those businesses transferred into employee ownership, since they're small companies and the people who work there are the ones most qualified to own it and run it into the future. So there's if you want to look up 50 by 50 is a organization, I think spun out of the Democracy Cooperative that's working on that. And there's a number of efforts that are specifically targeted just to transition to worker ownership. See a question?
I think that Bob's Red Mill is an example of that. I put that in the chat, but I'm not sure they're.
Yeah, and there's different structures. The biggest segment of employee ownership in this country is what's called ESOP, Employee Stock Ownership Program. It's very different than a cooperative because it's really a retirement benefit. It's better than no ownership for sure, but it's most commonly not coupled with governance rights. And then you do get a share of ownership. I think it's usually as like a yearly bonus, but it's actually worth nothing until you leave the company, and you can only sell it back to the company. So again, it's basically a retirement benefit if you work there 10, 20 years, whatever, and then you leave, you sell your shares back to the company, and then you can get paid out. So I do think it's a good thing, but it's definitely not direct economic democracy like we're talking about. There's some vesting of like, hey, I care about this place, I want to have some value to sell that stock back to, so I'm going to do a good job.
We used the ESOP at Motherware, and
Yeah.
at the end of our time we had about 15% ownership, but
Great.
you have to have significant cash flow, because basically you're buying the company from the owners, which is maybe a way of making a transition to employee ownership. But the ESOP could get majority ownership, and they could just sell the whole company, and the company would end, and they would just share proportionally to how much stock they had earned over time. But it doesn't necessarily result in a sustainable enterprise.
Yeah.
There's a lot of sort of tax advantages if your company has this cash flow. The cash advantages don't accrue to the workers.
Right.
So what we had been advised years ago, that was the strategy, and we were proudest and owned the company, but we wanted to figure out how do you exit. And then when we lost the company because the manufacturing of apparel moved out of the US, completely changed the whole dynamics, realized that there was no liability that the ESOP had. They only had assets, but the assets were only valuable if there's just a going concern and there's no, so it's maybe, it gives it the appearance of being socially responsible without necessarily being in practice that way.
Right. Yeah.
There's got to be a better way to help people transition from owning a company and wanting to be able to somehow capture some of what they've invested over their many years, and to make a transition to employee ownership or worker ownership.
Yeah, and if I understand correctly, it can actually be quite expensive, something like 50 to 100,000 just to set up the structure, and then the company has to be valued every year, which is another
expense, right? I mean, because
so you're paying all that money, and none of it's going directly into this, to benefit the staff.
And it's an ERISA employee, it has to do with the laws related to retirement security. So it's really designed as a retirement benefit. So yes, there's got to be better strategies for people who want to do that. I wouldn't recommend it in most cases. How do you support people who are making the transition without using all the legal expenses of that?
Exactly. Other thoughts, or I could kind of keep going on.
Well, are there a lot more consumer cooperatives in the country than there are worker cooperatives?
Yeah, absolutely.
And can they, the biggest problem sometimes is you could have the staff being alienated from the members because the management runs it in a maybe not a very inclusive, participatory way. So it seems
Yeah,
like that's
we were chatting, you know, kind of in the preamble here of, you know, you go into the consumer co-op and you ask the staff if they're workers, and they're like, or if they're owners, and they kind of look at you like, what does that mean? Like, whoa, you know,
well, they have a
doesn't-
union, that our co-op here that has a union, and that
Yeah, but-
union
yeah.
works in cooperation with the management and the board because they have similar same values, so it works out well. Before the union, it was more problematic, I think.
Sure, but you know, then I could also critique the union structure and say it's a little bit archaic and not very dynamic, and pretty costly, and doesn't really benefit the workers as much as a worker-owned cooperative, where there's that direct democracy and
Right.
and some simplicity, right? You're putting like a lot of complication in. You know, if you're just a grocery store, you know, to me, you know, it's simple enough. You can just self-organize and not involve the union. James?
Yeah, Shawn, what about co-determination in Europe, you know, in Germany in particular? And in other words, the after World War II, one of the reasons why Europe recovered was that people from the shop floor had seats on the board, and you know, and so it was to get the workers to elect members to the board, and the proportion was about 49 to 51%. I mean, they had a really strong voice at 49%. And so I think there's a potential for making unions dynamic, much more dynamic. But it obviously hasn't really panned out in the United States, especially.
Yeah, well, and that was kind of my point about the U.S. being a little bit behind in terms of actually, you know, cooperating or collaborating. Europe's far ahead of us in terms of, you know, having more cooperatives and more democracy in general, and more economic democracy, more inclusion, et cetera. I don't know, you know, that much about the European cooperatives, but I just know that it's more of a long-held and known tradition. And of course, there's the Mondragon cooperatives in the Basque region and the Emilia-Romagna region of Italy, where they're, you know, the entire region is completely run by cooperatives, which is wonderful.
It's my understanding that the U.S. military, at the end of the Second World War in Germany, was a part of the factor moving towards having the workers on the board, because they're concerned about what happened with the corporations in Germany being so aligned with the Nazi regime. So they were more idealistic than the business people, but because they were managing the country post, they could institute progressive things in the name of national security, which ended up being positive for the workers. That wasn't the intention necessarily. But that was
That's
the
exactly
result.
right.
Yeah.
I see a question in the chat from Marie. She's saying, are there cooperatives in the U.S. for small business or entrepreneurs to help poor communities? Definitely, at least on the worker-owned cooperative side, they're what would be called, you know, small or tiny or micro businesses. The largest worker-owned cooperative in the country is, I think, 2,500 worker owners. It's Cooperative Healthcare Associates in the Bronx, and they are an outlier in terms of being really large. Behind them, the biggest co-ops are, you know, 100 or 200 worker owners, with most of them being maybe 5, 10, 20, 30, you know, really small. And explicitly to help poor communities, probably a subset of that, but there is more happening. Cooperation Jackson that I mentioned is a network development in Jackson, Mississippi, which is Black and of course for historically disadvantaged community. So yeah, there's stuff happening. The Evergreen Cooperatives in Cleveland was specifically developed to create employment and worker ownership in the inner city Cleveland area that was very very high unemployment, very low median income, and with, of course, all the, lots of money being spent in the downtown, but all of it kind of leaving the area. So that's another example of a cooperative deliberately developed to, uplift the economic standard of the local.
The Evergreen also worked with the idea of key institutions, they weren't like hospitals or universities.
Yeah, anchor
They weren't going to
institutions.
they weren't going to be leaving the community, and that their ownership was invested in being in that particular place. And that seemed to be similar to Prout's idea of like key industries. It's not exactly the same, but it sort of has the same certain overlap of principles, but they're not going to leave. And so if they then hired the worker cooperatives, because it was hiring people in the local community, that was where the source of a lot of the funding came for Evergreen Cooperatives model.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, and I wish we had more of those.
Yeah, I'm curious about two areas, and they may be ones that you were intending to touch on, but I think a perennial challenge for co-op startups is capitalization. And I know there are entities, like shared capital or seed commons, a number of sources that kind of focus on supporting cooperative enterprise. But I'd be curious about trends. And the other area I'm curious about is if you're seeing any kind of development in the sort of governmental arena that is trying to be more supportive of cooperative enterprise, at either municipal, state, or even the federal level.
I haven't seen anything federal yet, or statewide, but yeah, you mentioned the seed commons. I put that in the chat there. It's a wonderful network of funds, regional funds. They only fund worker cooperatives, and they do it in what they call is a non-extractive funding model. So the funders don't take equity, they don't take governance rights, and they don't take any payments unless the cooperative can afford it. So they don't seize assets or do collections or anything like that. So it's a really wonderful group. My team, my company, we raised a venture fund called the Force for Good Fund that we raised specifically to invest in women and people of color owned businesses that have a barrier to getting capital. And about half the organizations we invested in were worker-owned cooperatives. But this is a very small, just $1 million fund, a little pilot fund. In terms of municipal funding, the best story I have is New York City. City Council has been directly funding worker cooperative development. Might be close to a decade now. And multi-millions of dollars a year. Started at maybe 1 million, and they've gone up to $2 and $3 million a year. And it's put into, the money goes through I forget what they call it, but it's a consortium of sorts of 16 or so cooperative development organizations in New York City that are all training co-ops or running co-ops. And so New York City's gone from there was less than 10 about a decade ago, and now there's well over 100 worker-owned cooperatives in New York City. So that's really a flourishing. So I was in I'm in New York, upstate New York, Hudson Valley now, but I was in San Francisco for a long time, and that was the biggest concentration of worker co-ops in the country since, I don't know, probably the 60s. And New York City has definitely eclipsed that just in the last few years. So that's really exciting. Berkeley City Council is putting a little bit of money into co-ops, but it's just nothing on the scale of what New York City's doing.
During the Carter administration, there was a national cooperative bank set up. Is that a significant source for the cooperative movement at all still, or is that still going?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, there are some. There's I think it's NCBA, National Cooperative Business Association. I mean, there's some networks I don't know about that bank specifically. There's certainly, I mean, credit unions, right, are cooperatives, and CDFIs are also cooperative investors. It's a cooperative bank that's an investment bank. But there's even there's a smaller subset of funders that are just funding worker cooperatives. So it's definitely, it's a gap. And while it's, you know, it's kind of exciting to that there's a couple instances to point to. There's another New England Cooperative Loan Fund, maybe. There's a couple other institutions, but again, it's just a teeny fraction of investment compared to investment capital that's going into other businesses.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's definitely
That-
a challenge and
sorry.
opportunity, right?
Dada just mentioned in the chat that there's a law in Italy. I also had a question about, you mentioned that there's a region in Italy. Could you repeat that, where cooperatives are particularly well developed?
Emilia Romagna, I think it's near Bologna. And they have some quite large, similar to the Mondragon cooperatives, where they'd be, you know, quite large multinational corporations, but that would be you know, cooperatively owned.
Okay, I hadn't heard of that. Thank you.
Yeah, James.
Shawn, are there foundations in the United States that put money into investing in cooperatives?
Maybe, but definitely not enough. Yeah, unfortunately, yeah. I mean, I think there's a little, you know, just maybe a little bit, but again, it's like it's not even seen. Actually, maybe I'll share this. I was going to share this other piece, kind of on my preamble of like, how do we move the social cycle forward? Maybe I'll jump and share on that because it might be interesting. So if you think of each phase of the social cycle being a loop, and so this loop being the current dominant cycle, right? So, or the merchant capitalist cycle here. There's this zenith moment at which it fundamentally, naturally goes into decline, right? And when that goes into decline, then the next phase actually starts. This is well known to humanity. If you want to look at the yin yang symbol in Taoism, is an elegant expression of this. This is a model from the Berkana Institute, some systems thinkers. But I was going to point out a couple of details here that I think are relevant in this moment, where again, us as Vipras, we want to accelerate this downturn and accelerate the emergence of the next phase of the solutions, right? So of course, the business as usual economy wants to like just go forever, grow forever, which is of course cannot happen, and we see how that's playing out. But that's the mindset, is no, we'll never decline. There is no alternative, right? And so if that has to die, if that has to end, then now it's in a hospice phase, right? And so we want to, you know, with compassion and no disrespect for anybody who's working for any of those organizations, it's really good work to make the harm less bad. And eventually, what we want to get to is midwifing the next system, and get to what we think of as the next economy that actually works for all life, or a prautistic economy, right? So there's a couple observations about this. One is from this vantage point, as a business as usual economy, this midwife curve is completely invisible, culturally invisible. So the idea that people could self-organize into small-scale cooperatives and provide their own needs is not seen as an option or a threat or even a thing, or it's just nowhere on the table. And as such, there would be no reason to invest money into it. Well, but it's actually happening. You know, I'm sharing some examples. One thing we do on our team, we have a podcast that we call Next Economy Now. And the point is, it's here. It's not fictional. We're not making this stuff up. There's robust solutions. They're just not fully integrated. We can't point to one country or one region that is completely advanced. Although we could look at some of the, you know, the social democracies in Europe and say, hey, they have a pretty high standard of living. So yeah, I just wanted to share that of, and so like this is what I think of is our role is, you know, how do we accelerate the hospice and bring in the midwife and kind of create a bridge for people to jump from the old system to the new system. And so, yeah, just seeing, you know, worker cooperatives, economic democracy, you know, Protestant values and principles as being, you know, the center, or at least a very high lever, right? If you think of, you know, democratic institutions, or the notion that the United States, for example, is a democratic institution, it's like, no, it really isn't. And it's not some conspiracy theory. It's just right there in public. The government is captured by corporate interests. There's, you can see how much money is being spent on lobbyists and the influence they have, and how hard it is for regular citizens to, you know, express themselves and have their concerns represented. So instead of, you know, what do we have, like 50% of the electorate going out once every 4 years to vote, you know, which is a pathetic turnout. You actually have a 2,000 hour a year full-time, you know, democratic engagement, democratic experience, which it changes people, you know, and that's where, you know, when I started running my company as a worker-owned cooperative, I quickly realized that, oh, okay, this is probably going to be my life work, is to offer this experience to other people, because it's not, I mean, you can talk about it and it maybe resonates, but it's very different if you go to work, and you know, I think some of you know this, but you know, if you work someplace for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years and you're a worker owner engaged in you know, dynamic self-governance, it changes people. They're different. They take that home, they take it to their families, they take it to their communities, they take it on in their life, whatever else they do next. So yeah, that's just want to lift up the profound impact of you know, creating these opportunities for people to experience.
I think for people that are, seed commons is definitely something to look at. Shared capital is a similar, it focuses on cooperatives, and actually they'll fund housing cooperatives, but exclusively cooperatives, but their model's somewhat different than the seed commons, where you set up sort of an affiliate local branch, in effect, of their model. There's also, and I'm drawing a blank on it, there's actually something that's starting to rival Mondragon and the Italian one in India, that's actually has a lot of cooperative enterprise, kind of in a regional area.
Okay.
Right, I can't think of the name right now.
Oh, I'd love to know. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely huge cooperatives in India. Yeah. Some of their big kind of household brands are you know, small decentralized co-ops. I mean, big, but you know, oh yeah, I see Donna's mentioning the Argentina collapse. Yeah, there's a great movie called The Take, right? If anybody's seen that, where the workers taking over the factories. Yeah, actually the seed commons actually comes directly out of that. because there's an organization that started CCOM, it's called the Working World, and they were in Argentina during the collapse, and they helped fund some of those takeovers, and then they came to the US and started funding co-ops in the US. So there's a direct line through there.
Are you familiar with the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies?
Yeah, they've rebranded as Common Future.
Okay.
Yeah,
Because they were
yeah.
an outgrowth of the Social Ventures Network. And the Social Ventures Network, before they did that, they created the Businesses for Social Responsibility, which they found out that actually that became greenwashing, because a company could say, oh yeah, we believe in social things, and then they would just join, but there was no standards. So then the local living economy movement, that was like an antidote reaction to that, because so many of the large companies like Ben & Jerry's and Adwala all they were getting funding from the stock market. And so they lost, the companies got taken over, even though the owners didn't want that to happen. The local living economies, it seemed to me, I was going to the conferences, and is that they were missing the ownership model, because local economies could be monopoly, a small scale monopoly that sells out. So it's not a very long-term sustainable, even if you have a local owner who's very successful and buys up other businesses in the community, they often cash out by finding some much larger organization. So was a model that has some good elements, but it's missing the ownership piece.
Exactly, right. And that was kind of why I showed the loops, right? Because like the capitalist model is all about concentrating capital, concentrating ownership, concentrating control, and can't even imagine, distributing it.
Right.
There's such an opportunity. James?
Yeah, Jacqueline and I knew Judy Wicks, who launched the Bali, and that's exactly right. There was a lot of rhetoric there that came out of her restaurant, the White Dog Cafe, about new wave business models, but it really didn't scale up. And in fact, she was sort of an arch capitalist herself, so it was kind of doomed, I think. But the question I wanted to ask you was that where do you see the tipping point now in terms of scaling up cooperative models? What can we expect, and where does that rest on the cycle of the four functional figures that you talk about, moving from how do we get to the full-fledged worker movement phase? How does that happen? What do you see that like?
Honestly, I wish I knew. I think it's highly uncertain and emergent. P.R. Sarkar said himself, it would be lovely, right, if we could just plead with the capitalists and they would hand over control. That's not what's happening. Anybody who pays attention to the COP gatherings are just nauseating, where they all get together and talk about how they're not gonna make any changes until another 20 years. I really don't know. Nobody, not nobody, but most of us didn't see the COVID-19 pandemic coming, and some really powerful things shifted for that, including the first time that carbon actually dropped, when there was the global carbon emissions actually dropped on target with the Paris Accords, despite all the attention to not be on target for the Paris Accords. So I didn't see that coming, but there's a lot of change that came out of that. So I don't know, some type of disruption. I mean, the patterns going forward that I think are reliable is more and more extreme climate events, causing more and more damage, destruction, and climate refugees. So there's something like a billion people that are on coastal areas, which humanity gathers around water, that they're all, many are on the move today, and will be on the move. So I think that's a huge factor. One pattern that's related to that is when disaster does hit, and there's some either relief or emergent priority that kind of replaces the overstructure, which the overstructure is like go to work, stay in line, follow the system. When that's disrupted, people naturally just jump in and cooperate and help each other. And that's fairly well documented. So, as painful as it is, I think these disrupting events are going to result in a lived experience of cooperative and community and mutual aid, and then that will be carried forward because it's so much more meaningful than everybody's kind of isolated, independent economic experience of basically being a wage slave is what really is going on.
There's sort of a polarization during the pandemic between there's the huge growth in wealth inequality that happened during the pandemic with the billionaires gaining so much value, a huge growth, and the mutual aid, which was done without necessarily a lot of capital at all, a lot of people. So it's like it's going to have to be through greater and greater involvement of people, as the capital it's very easy to concentrate into fewer and fewer hands, but the change has to happen with more and more people.
Perhaps on that kind of mixed hopeful note, we've come to the end of our official time. Maybe if you have any comments to wrap up with, or if there are any final questions, we can address those.
Yeah, I mean, my comments, I guess, just to summarize, is hopeful that where we could look at the global geopolitical and climate change stuff and be really discouraged, and rightly so. I think we should be sober about that. But if we also look at the solutions, I think they're really hopeful, and they're truly abundant. That's the thing I think that's again missing from the capitalistic worldview, and this kind of limited idea of like gross domestic product, is how rich your life can be when you're just cooperating on a simple enterprise with a small group of people that benefits your local bioregion, right? So proud we have a vision of going back to regional economies, not explicitly, but mostly, like relocalizing most production and consumption, like 80% or something like that, which means we get to get really in tune with what can we grow here, what can we make here, what are our vertically integrated supply chains right where we live, and how do we know our neighbors and share and work together, and the outcome of all that stuff, and this is my lived experience. It's a lot of fun. With my woodworking cooperative, the tunes were bumping. You know what I'm saying? We were listening to great music. We had friends making beautiful lunch, big family style lunch for everybody. I had an herbalist that had medicine there that people would get treated with. People would come in to visit and change their idea of what a small business could be like. So as grim as it is, I have faith in kind of the abundance of nature and human spirit and supreme consciousness that when we collaborate, we can really create more light and joy and abundance to outshine the shadows that are looming. So that's my little go get them. Economic democracy, cooperate, we can do it. So thanks everybody for your time and commitment. I'm gonna put in some of my links. There's my email. Please be in touch. Here's my company. We do teach an MBA where we share the business mechanics that we see supporting these type of enterprises. We have over 400 people that have been through that course. We have that course curriculum is now being published into a book. which is on pre-sale now. There's the link for the book. There's the podcast. And here's my slide deck for today. So
Thank you.
thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shawn.
Wanna
Thank you. Let's go,
Get
everybody.
your slide bank here from the chat before we leave.